I'm Elena, 30 years old, and on the night of my brother's $800,000 wedding, my mother stood in front of 500 guests and announced I was no longer part of the family. After years of sacrifice caring for my bedridden father running the family business quietly, while my mother and brother lived lavishly, I thought I would finally be seen, finally be valued for everything I gave up. I thought my father's promise would protect me, that I'd still have a place in the family he built. But instead, in the middle of that glittering ballroom, my mother erased me with a single sentence. The music stopped. The guests stared, and I felt the coldest kind of humiliation sink into my bones. What she didn't know was that the lawyer was already on his way carrying the real will that would change everything. They believed they could discard me in front of everyone. But that was the exact moment justice walked through the door. I grew up in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. A sprawling, centuries-old estate with towering ceilings, endless corridors, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from gilded frames. From the outside, it was impressive, grand, dignified, the kind of place that commanded respect. But inside, it was cold. The walls echoed with silence more than laughter, and the air always felt heavy, like it was filled with unspoken rules. My father was a strict man, but he was fair. He believed in discipline, in structure, in earning what you were given. He didn't express affection in the way most fathers did, but he was the only person who truly saw me. He would look at me, his eyes softening just a little, and say, "You're stronger than you think, Elena. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." To him, I was capable, reliable. But even his kindness was quiet, hidden under layers of restraint. My mother was different. Eleanor was elegant and ambitious, always calculating her next move. She believed family was about legacy, not love. And in her eyes, daughters were temporary. They would eventually marry and belong to someone else. Sons, however, were the future. Sons were permanent. So from the moment my younger brother Lucas was born, she poured everything into him. Lucas was 5 years younger than I, and from the very beginning, it was clear he would never know the word no. While I was taught to be composed, selfless, and responsible, he was celebrated for every whim and tantrum. When he wanted the better toy, I was expected to give it to him. When he wanted my room because it had better light, I moved without question. My mother's favorite phrase was always the same. "Elena, you're the older one. You have to sacrifice for your brother." That sacrifice became the blueprint of my life. Lucas was enrolled in the best private schools, given every opportunity money could buy. When he turned 18, my mother handed him the keys to a brand new luxury car without hesitation. For his 18th birthday, they threw a lavish party that cost more than some people's homes. For mine, a modest dinner at home and a reminder from my mother to set a good example for your brother. I meanwhile stayed in the background. While Lucas traveled to Europe for summer programs and studied abroad in luxury, I remained at home to help manage the family affairs. My father trusted me with the numbers, with the operations of the family business. But there was no paycheck, no recognition. I was told, "It's all for the good of the family." As the years passed, the disparity only grew more obvious. Lucas became charming, but spoiled a young man who believed the world owed him everything. He hosted extravagant parties, wasted money without a second thought, and was constantly surrounded by people who flattered him. My mother never saw fault in him. To her, he was our future, the rightful heir to everything. I remember the day my father fell ill. It started slowly, fatigue, then hospital visits, then endless rounds of treatment. I was the one who stayed by his side. I managed his care, spoke to the doctors, and researched treatments late at night. I even used my savings to pay for medications when my mother complained that it was getting too expensive, and Lucas, he was nowhere to be found. He would appear occasionally, always dressed impeccably, always late, staying just long enough to take a few photos for social media before leaving for his next vacation. My mother never scolded him. She would just say, "Lucas has his own life. He's busy." One evening I sat by my father's bed while he struggled to breathe. He reached for my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Elena, you've done more for me than anyone else. You've been the one holding this family together. Don't worry, everything will be fair." I promise you, you won't be left behind." I believed him. I believed that despite my mother's favoritism, despite Lucas's entitlement, my father would make sure I wasn't erased. But as his health declined, I began noticing things I couldn't explain. My mother started holding private meetings with the family lawyer meetings I wasn't invited to. She and Lucas would leave the house together and return hours later whispering in the hallway. When I asked, my mother would smile and say, "Just some family business. Nothing you need to worry about." Then one afternoon, I was walking past the sitting room and heard her voice low but sharp. "Don't worry," she said, her tone almost soothing. "She won't get anything. I've already made sure of it." Lucas laughed, a cruel, satisfied sound. "Good. She's been the help for so long she should be used to having nothing." I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they would hear it. I didn't dare move closer, afraid the floorboards would creak and give me away. I just stood there numb, realizing that whatever they were planning, it was bigger than I'd imagined. After that, I started seeing the signs everywhere. The staff avoided meeting my eyes as if they knew something, but couldn't say it. Important documents from the office disappeared from my desk. My mother locked her study, which she had never done before. I felt the walls closing in. Despite the growing dread, I kept holding on to my father's promise. I told myself that even if they were scheming, the truth would come out in the will. My father wouldn't have allowed them to take everything. But deep down I knew. I could feel the ground shifting under me, even if I couldn't see the full picture yet. The closer it got to my brother's wedding, the clearer it became that they were preparing for something. My mother poured all her energy into planning a celebration that cost nearly $1 million, sparing no expense to show off our family's wealth. Lucas basked in the attention, flaunting every detail of the event. And me, I was treated like an outsider in my own home. They barely spoke to me. The wedding invitation arrived like a formality, an afterthought. It was then I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me. And yet I stayed silent. I watched. I waited. Because something told me that the truth, no matter how carefully they buried it, had a way of coming back. What I didn't know then was just how public their betrayal would become, and how spectacularly it would unravel. I had always been their reliable one. While Lucas was being pampered and groomed as the future of the family, I quietly built the skills no one else wanted to learn. I studied business management in college, not because it was my dream, but because my father said it would help the company. My mother never praised me for it. She treated it as my duty. Lucas, on the other hand, was allowed to choose anything he wanted. He drifted from art classes in Paris to a photography program in Milan, burning through money like it was endless. When I graduated, I didn't take the time to explore the world or find my passion. I went straight to the family company. I worked tirelessly behind the scenes, reorganizing finances, smoothing over conflicts with suppliers, managing the staff my brother never bothered to remember. My father trusted me with everything that truly mattered, because he knew Lucas couldn't handle it. There were moments when the company was on the brink of disaster. A failed investment almost wiped out one of our major accounts. A supplier scandal threatened our reputation. Lucas was nowhere to be found, of course. He was busy hosting parties on yachts in Monaco, while I stayed up night after night poring over spreadsheets, calling contacts, negotiating quiet deals to save us from collapse. I fixed it. Every time I fixed it. But to my mother, it wasn't an accomplishment. It was just what a good daughter does. I remember once, after averting a huge financial crisis that would have cost millions, I came home exhausted, hoping just for a second for a word of acknowledgement. Instead, she was sitting in the living room with Lucas showing him swatches for his new custom suit. She didn't even look up. "Dinner's in the kitchen," she said flatly. "And Elena, make sure the office files are organized for Lucas's meeting tomorrow. He wants to see what's happening at the company." Lucas's meeting. That was the joke. He would show up for 15 minutes, charm the board members with empty words, then leave before any real work was done. He liked to call himself the future CEO, but didn't know a single thing about how the business ran. This was my life. Always cleaning up the mess, always being the quiet backbone, never the face. And then, when my father fell ill, my responsibilities doubled. He needed someone to manage the company, while also making sure his care was handled properly. My mother didn't want the burden. Lucas couldn't be bothered. So I stepped in. I was there for every doctor's appointment, every long night at the hospital. I coordinated the medical team, hired private nurses, and made sure he had the best treatments available. When my mother complained that it was all too expensive and questioned whether it was even worth it, I used my savings. It hurt more than I can describe to see the man who had been strong all my life reduced to weakness. But even in his worst moments, his eyes still carried that same quiet strength. Meanwhile, Lucas vanished. He stopped coming home altogether. He was too busy planning his engagement party, too busy attending art exhibits and high-end galas with his fiancée. He didn't call. He didn't visit. And my mother, she was consumed with wedding plans. Every day she was on the phone with florists, designers, and planners, creating what she called the most spectacular wedding of the decade. She didn't sit by my father's bedside. She didn't hold his hand. She didn't cry. I did. I remember one particular night. My father was awake, lucid for once, his breathing shallow but steady. He asked me to sit closer. His hand, weak, trembling, reached for mine. "Elena," he whispered, his voice soft but sure. "You've given everything for this family. I see it. I know it. You're the only one who stood by me." "Don't talk like that, Dad," I murmured, fighting back tears. "No, listen," he said, his tone firmer despite the strain. "Lucas is not ready. Your mother, she has her own ideas. But you," he paused to catch his breath, "you are the only one worthy. Everything I have will be yours. I promise. You will not be left behind." I squeezed his hand, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. "Thank you," I whispered. "I'll take care of everything, I promise." For a brief moment I felt peace. I believed that all the sacrifices, the endless nights of work, the dreams I'd abandoned, the years I'd given, would mean something. But even as he made that promise, the rest of the house was moving on without him. Lucas was posting photos from bachelor parties in Ibiza. My mother was in the city picking out her outfit for the wedding rehearsal. She didn't even notice when my father's condition worsened. When I called to tell her the doctors were worried, she simply said, "I'm sure you can handle it, Elena. I'm very busy right now." In those final days, I felt like I was living in two worlds. One, where I was the daughter holding everything together, and another, where I was invisible to the very people who should have been there. When my father passed, it was quiet. Just me and a nurse in the room. My mother didn't make it in time. Lucas didn't even know until I called him hours later. I organized the funeral. I handled the guests, the arrangements, and the paperwork. My mother complained about the flowers not being elegant enough. Lucas made a dramatic appearance at the service, acting like the grieving son for the cameras before slipping away with his fiancée to attend a private dinner. I told myself it was almost over, that soon the will would be read and everything would be made right. But something deep inside me was unsettled. I noticed my mother making more frequent trips into the city with Lucas. I overheard their whispers, just fragments of sentences like, "Don't worry, it's already arranged and she won't get anything." I wanted to believe they were wrong, that they couldn't undo my father's wishes, that his promise would hold. So I waited. I threw myself into my work, into keeping the company running smoothly, even as the wedding plans grew more outrageous by the day. Lucas bragged about the venue, a historic estate booked for $500,000. He talked about imported flowers, a 10-course meal, a live orchestra. My mother glowed with pride every time he opened his mouth. And me, I received a formal invitation in the mail, with a note scrawled by my mother. "It would be nice if you could come." That was all I was to them, an afterthought. Still, I held on to my father's words. "Everything I have will be yours." I wanted to believe that my years of sacrifice would finally be recognized, that in the end, I wouldn't be erased. But as the wedding day drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something I couldn't yet see. I didn't know then that the day meant to humiliate me would become the very day everything changed. After the funeral, the house felt eerily calm. Too calm. I expected grief to hang in the air like a heavy fog, But instead, there was an almost unsettling lightness in my mother and Lucas's demeanor. They didn't seem weighed down by loss. If anything, they seemed relieved. My mother wore black for the first week, but her eyes were dry, her posture poised, her mind already elsewhere. Lucas made only a token appearance at the funeral, then disappeared again with his fiancée for an engagement retreat in the Maldives. I stayed in the mansion sorting through my father's belongings, coordinating with the staff, quietly mourning. Meanwhile, my mother spent her afternoons in the city. When she returned, she would go straight to her study with locked folders in her arms and Lucas at her side. What unsettled me most was how the reading of the will kept getting delayed. It was supposed to happen within 2 weeks, but when I called the family lawyer, his tone was unusually evasive. "Elena," he said, "there are some procedural matters that need clarification. Your mother has requested a slight postponement." A week later, I called again. Still reviewing documents, he muttered, "Your mother's handling it." That's when the unease turned into suspicion. My father had been meticulous, almost obsessive about planning. He would never have left loose ends. Then came the first real warning. I was walking past the west corridor one late afternoon when I heard voices coming from my mother's study. Her door was slightly ajar. I froze when I heard her say, her voice smooth but firm, "Yen tum konse ka tut ka. Na se chang yunduxi." Even though it was in Vietnamese, I didn't need a translation. "Don't worry, you'll get everything. She won't get a single thing." Lucas's low chuckle followed. "Good. She's been playing housemaid for so long. She should already know her place." My blood ran cold. I stepped back into the shadow of the hallway, careful not to make a sound. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the closed door, realizing that everything I'd feared might actually be true. The next day, one of the house staff, an older woman who'd worked for my father for decades, found me in the kitchen. She glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Miss Elena," she whispered, "be careful. There are things happening you don't know about, things you might not like." Before I could press her for more, she straightened up quickly and walked away, leaving me with nothing but the echo of her warning. I tried to confront my mother later that evening. We were in the solarium, the golden light of sunset spilling across the glass. "When is the will reading?" I asked. My voice was calm but firm. She didn't even look up from her tea. "It's being handled. Don't worry yourself. I spoke with the lawyer. He said you've been requesting delays." She set her cup down slowly, then turned her gaze toward me with that thin, sharp smile I'd grown to hate. "Kondungdangi," she said softly. "My tudo hupfap. Everything is exactly as it should be." I opened my mouth to press further, but the look she gave me was final, a quiet warning to stay silent. That night, I received a message from Lucas. It was short. "Cruel. You were never important in this family. Don't expect anything. Don't embarrass yourself." I stared at the words, my hands trembling. For a brief moment, I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. But then I remembered my father's voice in those final days. "You are the only one worthy. Everything I have will be yours." That promise was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. So I waited. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe they were panicking about the transition. Maybe the lawyer truly was disorganized. Maybe I was imagining the worst. But deep down, the dread was growing heavier each day. The wedding preparations escalated around me like a parade I wasn't invited to join. Invitations went out to the city's elite. The caterers delivered tasting menus for my mother and Lucas to sample. I overheard plans for a custom gown worth $100,000, a floral installation imported from Europe, a 10-course dinner with rare wine pairings. And through it all, they barely acknowledged me. I became a ghost in my own home, watching my mother and brother waltz through glittering plans while I quietly bore the weight of everything my father left behind. The mansion no longer felt like it belonged to me. The lawyer still didn't call. Every night before I went to bed, I would replay every conversation with my father in my mind, clinging to his words like a lifeline. You will not be left behind. But I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The way the staff avoided eye contact, the way the lawyer's tone grew colder each time I called, the way my mother smiled at me now like a predator who had already won. Something was coming. I could feel it tightening around me, a noose I couldn't see, but knew was there. And then the wedding invitation arrived. It was beautiful, embossed in gold foil, hand-delivered. Inside was a single note in my mother's sharp, controlled handwriting. It would be appropriate for you to attend. After all, it's a family event. Family. The word made my stomach twist. I placed the invitation on my desk and stared at it for a long time. I didn't know yet how they planned to destroy me. I didn't know exactly what they'd done with my father's will. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever they were hiding would be revealed soon, and when it was, everything would change. The day of Lucas's wedding was blindingly bright, the kind of day made for glossy magazine covers and endless social media posts. The venue was a sprawling estate outside the city, draped in cascading white orchids imported from Singapore, crystal chandeliers suspended from an arched glass ceiling, and tables set with gold-plated cutlery. Guests arrived in luxury cars wearing designer gowns and tailored suits. It was a spectacle worth every dollar of the $800,000 price tag. I arrived quietly, dressed simply but elegantly, in a black silk gown that contrasted sharply with the sea of glittering gold and ivory around me. Heads turned when I entered, not because I was meant to stand out, but because my presence was unexpected. My mother's eyes flickered when she saw me, a split second of surprise before her expression shifted into a tight, polite smile. Lucas smirked openly, like he was waiting for a private joke to unfold. The ceremony itself was extravagant to the point of excess. A live orchestra played softly as Lucas and his bride-to-be walked down an aisle lined with towering floral arrangements. Photographers flitted about, capturing every detail. My mother was radiant, basking in the glow of the spectacle she had created. I stayed silent, sitting at a table near the back, watching it all unfold. My heart was pounding in my chest, an unease I couldn't shake, growing heavier by the minute. I didn't know exactly what they had planned, but I could feel it coming like a storm creeping over the horizon. When the vows ended and the reception began, the lights dimmed to a soft golden glow. Guests raised their glasses as my mother took the stage. She looked flawless in her silver gown, her posture straight, her voice calm and commanding. She started with pleasantries, thanking the guests for joining this historic celebration for our family. And then, with a slight smile, she said the words that cut through me like ice. "Before we continue this evening, there's something I'd like to clarify." She paused, letting the anticipation build. "As of today, Elena is no longer part of this family." The room went silent. 500 guests turned their heads toward me. I felt every pair of eyes on me, some wide with shock, some narrowing with judgment, some gleaming with the morbid thrill of scandal. My throat tightened, but I didn't move. I just stared at my mother, unable to process the cruelty of what she'd just done. She continued, her tone syrupy but sharp. "Elena has chosen a different path for herself. She made the decision to step away from her responsibilities, and therefore she has no claim to the Whitmore family estate or its future." A few whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. I could hear snippets. Did she just say no claim, and what does she mean? Step away? My mother glanced toward Lucas and smiled. "Lucas, as you all know, is the rightful heir to our family's legacy. He will continue the work our family has built for generations." Lucas stepped forward, wrapping an arm around his bride. He grinned at me like a cat cornering its prey. It was in that moment I understood. They had erased me completely. I felt my pulse thundering in my ears as my mother waved to a man in a suit. He stepped forward holding a folder. "This," she said, "is the formal documentation." He opened the folder and displayed papers on a large projection screen for the guests to see. I recognized the company seal. I recognized my name on the page. It was a legal statement, a renunciation. It said I had voluntarily given up my claim to the inheritance, the properties the company shares, the entire $10 million estate. Except I had never signed anything like that. The signature on the document looked like mine at first glance, but I knew instantly it wasn't. The loops in the letters were off. The angle of the strokes was wrong. They had forged it. The air in the room grew thick. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at me with thinly veiled curiosity, as if waiting to see me explode. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping lightly against the polished floor. My voice, when it came, was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "What is this?" I said, looking directly at my mother. She didn't flinch. "Proof," she replied simply. "Proof that you willingly stepped away. Your father was unwell at the end. Confused. He didn't know what he was doing. I simply made the decisions he was too weak to make. This is what's best for the family." I felt my body trembling. "You forged my name." "No," she said calmly. "I corrected a mistake. You were never meant to carry this responsibility." Lucas laughed, then a short, cruel sound. "Come on, Elena. Don't act so surprised. You were born to serve this family, not to lead it. Now that your job is done, you're free. Go build your little life somewhere else." My eyes snapped to him. "Dad wanted me to have the company. He told me Dad isn't here." Lucas interrupted, smirking. "And even if he were, you know Mom always had the final word." My mother added the final blow. "Con gai roi kung dile chung." Girls leave, sons stay. The money belongs where it should with Lucas. That's how it's always been, and that's how it will remain. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the walls of the ballroom were closing in, trapping me in this humiliating moment. My vision blurred at the edges. I heard whispers spreading like wildfire among the guests. I could see Lucas's fiancée stepping back uneasily, sensing the tension, but not understanding it fully. For a brief second, I felt like I was going to collapse right there in front of them. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sheer audacity of it all pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. But something inside me shifted. The numbness that had been creeping in all night crystallized into something cold. I straightened my back. My face went still unreadable. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer than was comfortable. And then I spoke, my voice calm even. "I see." I turned to the guests who were staring at me like they were watching a play they didn't quite understand. Then I looked back at my mother and Lucas one last time. "You've made your choice," I said softly. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my clutch, walked through the sea of murmuring guests, and left the ballroom. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated me, erased me, made me nothing. But as I stepped into the cool night air outside the venue, I felt something ignite quietly inside me. This wasn't the end. This was the moment I decided they would regret everything. ChatGPT and I didn't cry that night. I went home after leaving the ballroom, shut the door to my small apartment, and sat in silence. The humiliation still burned hot in my chest, but beneath it, something colder had settled. It wasn't despair. It wasn't even sadness. It was resolve. The next morning, I called the only person I trusted, Maya. She wasn't just my closest friend. She was a sharp, unyielding lawyer who had built her reputation on uncovering corporate fraud and family disputes. When I told her I needed her help, her tone shifted immediately. "Tell me everything," she said. We met in a quiet cafe away from the city center. I brought the invitation, the memories of what had been said, and the weight of my father's final words. I told her about the will that had never been read, about the mysterious delays, about the forged document they had displayed at the wedding. Maya listened without interrupting, her eyes focused, her mind already turning. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. "They forged your signature, and they probably tampered with your father's will when he was too weak to fight back. This isn't just betrayal, it's fraud." My heart tightened, but I nodded. "I want to prove it." "Then we start quietly," she said. "No one can know we're looking. Not yet." And so we began. Maya filed discreet requests for access to the original legal documents. She traced the timeline of when the amended will had been filed and who had witnessed it. Meanwhile, I started going through my father's belongings that had been packed away. I searched for anything he might have left, letters, notes, anything that hinted at his true intentions. Within weeks, the pieces started to come together. Maya uncovered the original draft of my father's will safely stored in a firm's archives, showing clearly that I was listed as the primary beneficiary. The amendment that gave everything to Lucas. It had been filed only 3 weeks before my father's death, at a time when he was barely conscious most days. She dug deeper. The handwriting on the amendment didn't match my father's usual signature. It was shaky, forced, likely signed under duress or outright forged. The supposed renunciation I had signed was an even sloppier forgery. A handwriting expert confirmed what we already knew: it wasn't mine. And there was more. Bank records revealed large, quiet transfers from my father's private accounts to new trusts under Lucas's name, starting months before my father even passed. Those transfers were signed off not by my father, but by a power of attorney document that my mother had pushed through when he was already bedridden. It wasn't just a moment of opportunism, it was a plan. My mother and Lucas had been plotting for years, waiting for my father's illness to become their excuse. They had carefully prepared to strip me of everything the moment he was too weak to fight back. When Maya laid it all out in front of me, I felt both sick and strangely calm. "All these years," I whispered. "It was never about family, it was always about control." Maya looked at me. "So what do you want to do? We can go to court quietly. We'll win. But I can tell you, don't just want the money back." I met her eyes and let the silence stretch for a beat. "No," I said finally. "This isn't just about money. They humiliated me in public. They made sure every person in that room saw me as nothing. I'm not going to let them bury the truth in some courtroom where no one sees it." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "So you want this to be public?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And I want it to happen on their terms, on their stage, just like they did to me." That was the day I decided to cut ties completely. I called my mother once. She answered with that same calm, superior tone. "Elena," she said, "have you come to your senses? You should be grateful we even—" I cut her off. "You're no longer my mother. Do not call me. Do not write to me. As far as I'm concerned, you no longer exist." There was silence on the other end, then a cold laugh. "You can't fight us. You have nothing." I hung up. From that day forward, I stopped thinking of them as family. They were simply my enemies. Meanwhile, Lucas continued to flaunt his new life. He posted endless photos of wedding rehearsals, designer suits, and luxury honeymoon destinations. He bragged to the press about the legacy he was inheriting, giving interviews about how he would modernize the company and honor our father's vision. I watched it all from the sidelines, quiet but not idle. Maya and I worked in the shadows. We gathered every piece of evidence: the forged documents, the bank transfers, the handwriting analysis, and witness statements from staff who had seen my mother manipulate my father's legal affairs. We compiled it all into a single, airtight case. And then I went one step further. I reached out to a respected investigative journalist who specialized in high-profile family scandals. I handed over the evidence under strict timing instructions. The story would be ready, waiting to go live when I gave the signal. But I wanted more than headlines. I wanted them to feel the same humiliation they had inflicted on me. So I chose the stage they had chosen for themselves: the wedding. Lucas's grand $500,000 wedding, the one my mother had called the crowning moment for the Whitmore family. I decided I wouldn't just show up. I would arrive with Maya at my side, with the journalist ready, with the evidence already validated and notarized. I would let them stand there surrounded by 500 of their closest friends and allies, basking in stolen glory. And then I would take it all back. I could already imagine it. The lights, the music, the perfectly curated image of success and power. And then the truth cuts through all of it like a blade. I looked at Maya as we finalized the plan. "They wanted me silent," I said quietly. "But I'm going to make sure everyone remembers this day for the rest of their lives. Not for the wedding, but for the truth." She nodded, her voice low. "Then we wait. And we strike when it matters most." And so I waited. While they planned their perfect celebration, I planned their perfect downfall. I wouldn't crash the wedding. I would reclaim everything at the wedding. And when it was over, no one would ever look at them the same way again. The day of the wedding arrived like the calm before a storm. The venue was the same extravagant estate where I had been humiliated before, but this time, I wasn't coming as the forgotten daughter. I stepped out of the car in a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the soft sunlight. Beside me was Maya, composed and ready. Behind us trailed a small team, a journalist holding a camera, an investigator with sealed files, and two paralegals with notarized documents in hand. As I walked into the ballroom, heads turned. The whispers started instantly. My mother froze when she saw me, her expression flickering between shock and suspicion. Lucas, standing confidently at the altar, smirked at me like I was an uninvited guest who didn't know her place. The music began. Guests settled into their seats, chatting excitedly, their glasses of champagne glinting in the golden light. Lucas and his bride-to-be made their grand entrance, basking in the applause of 500 guests. And then, just as the officiant prepared to begin the vows, the MC's voice echoed through the hall. Before we proceed with this ceremony, he said, his tone calm but deliberate. There is a message that must be shared with everyone here. Please turn your attention to the screen. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. The massive screen at the front of the room flickered to life. It began with a clear close-up shot of my father's original will. The audience could see every detail, the date, the official seal, and most importantly, my name as the primary beneficiary. The narration began calm and precise. This is the authentic last will of Mr. Whitmore, signed and notarized months before his passing. It names his daughter, Elena Whitmore, as the rightful heir to his entire estate, including all properties, company shares, and financial assets totaling $10 million. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother's face turned pale. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. The video continued. Side-by-side comparisons of signatures filled the screen. The strong, steady signature of my father on the original will versus the shaky, forged scrawl on the so-called amendment that transferred everything to Lucas. Then came the forged renunciation of my inheritance, with a handwriting expert explaining the obvious inconsistencies. Both of these documents were submitted fraudulently, the narration continued. They do not reflect the true wishes of the late Mr. Whitmore. Then the final blow, a recorded testimony from the family's own lawyer, the man who had been part of their plan but had chosen to come clean. His voice was shaky but clear. I was pressured by Eleanor Whitmore and her son Lucas to alter the will. I regret my involvement. I can no longer keep this secret. The true heir is Elena Whitmore. She was meant to have everything. The room erupted in chaos. Guests gasped loudly, some whispering frantically to each other. Lucas's fiancée turned to him, her face pale with horror. "Is this true?" she demanded. Lucas stammered, his composure unraveling. It's fake. It's all fake." But the evidence kept coming. The video showed bank transfers, millions quietly moved into Lucas's accounts months before my father died. Emails between my mother and Lucas discussing how to handle me. Every detail meticulously laid bare for the entire room to see. By the time the screen went black, the silence was deafening. Then Lucas's bride took a step back, shaking her head in disgust. She ripped off her veil, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't marry you," she whispered. "You lied to everyone. You're a fraud." She turned and fled the ballroom, her mother chasing after her. Guests began to murmur, some grabbing their phones to call their drivers, others snapping discreet photos of the unfolding disaster. Before Lucas could react, two uniformed officers stepped through the side doors. "Lucas Whitmore," one of them said. "You are under investigation for inheritance fraud and financial misconduct. You need to come with us." "What?" "No." "This is a mistake," Lucas shouted, but his voice cracked. He turned to my mother. "Mom, do something." But my mother was frozen. Her perfect posture collapsed. Her hands trembled as the officers turned to her. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are also under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud. We need you to accompany us for questioning." Her face turned ashen. The crowd parted as they were led away. The photographers who had been hired to document the perfect wedding snapped photo after photo of the very public disgrace. And me? I stood silently in the center of the room, watching it all. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let the truth speak louder than anything I could have said. By the next morning, the scandal was everywhere. Headlines screamed high society wedding exposed as fraud bride flees heir arrested. Social media buzzed with videos from the ceremony. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of prestige, was now synonymous with deceit. Within weeks, the court validated the original will. My father's true intentions were honored. The company, the properties, the $10 million, they were all rightfully restored to me. Lucas was charged with fraud and embezzlement. My mother faced her own legal battles along with the complete collapse of her reputation. I didn't move back into the mansion. I didn't want it. Instead, I sold the estate and used part of the money to rebuild the company properly, creating a charitable foundation in my father's name, a foundation that actually helped people, not just served as a vanity project. I bought a modest but beautiful home by the coast, a place filled with warmth and quiet. For the first time in my life, I chose a space that was entirely mine. A few family members, distant cousins, who had remained neutral, reached out to tell me they admired my strength. And Maya, my unwavering friend, stood by me through it all. I learned that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who stand with you when everyone else turns away. I never forgave my mother or Lucas. Forgiveness wasn't necessary. I simply let them fade into the past where they belonged. In the end, I reclaimed everything they tried to take from me, not just the money, but my dignity, my voice, my future. And I learned one truth that I will never forget. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Justice isn't given, it's taken. So I'll ask you now, the one listening to my story. If you were me, would you have forgiven them, or would you have done exactly what I did? Because sometimes the only way to survive betrayal is to make sure the people who tried to destroy you never forget the cost of underestimating you.